Recording is for CSE 262 Technology, Ethics, and Global Society, being taught at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. My name is Annie Pagura, and I am your professor for this course. This course is being taught completely online, and I am not local to the Oxford area right now. So if we need to have any kind of office hours or you need to talk to me about anything, we can set up a WebEx or a Skype or a phone call, whatever is easiest. Your best option is to just email me and we'll set something up. Okay, so the objectives. What is this book about? What are ethics and morality and how do they differ? Why does society strive to create an environment that is unanimously considered moral? What theories do they rely on to create this ideal environment? When faced with a dilemma, we often need to consider what course of action is right or best. You are beginning this class with some ideas of what you consider right and wrong, good or bad. Your ideas might be different from my ideas. What you say is right might not be the same as what I say is right. And where do your ideas of right and wrong come from? Should we simply agree to disagree and just learn to get along, or can we justify our ideas of good and bad and of right and wrong? CSE 262 examines dilemmas that you might face in your profession and gives you ways to think about and analyze these situations so that you can think critically about those dilemmas. In this way, you'll be better able to make better decisions about how to approach those dilemmas and better able to justify those decisions in ways that are appropriate to others in your profession and in society in general. What is Chapter 1 about? We're going to go over several case studies and their context. We'll discuss some moral theories and some ethical reasoning. Case studies. This chapter begins with several case studies similar to real situations we may have encountered or might one day encounter. In each of these cases, the big question is, what is the right thing to do? This is not always a simple question to answer. As you consider each case study, we will also look at how context can change how we think about the situation. In this course, context can and should affect how we think about those situations. As context changes, you might find yourself shifting your view of what is the right thing to do. Under moral theories, we're going to discuss ethics and morality and how they're related, but are not the same thing. Ethical discussions should be connected to underlying moral theories. We will look at roughly 10 well-known moral theories. These will form a foundation on which we will build ethical discussions and arguments in the rest of the course. Different disciplines use different methods of reasoning. For example, scientists use different approaches to solve problems engineers use. Similarly, ethical arguments and proofs look very different from mathematical arguments and proofs. In Chapter 1, we will look at some guidelines that will help you through the course as you write about and discuss ethical issues. So this first story, before we get this first case, I apologize. The case is about hacking an airplane. Before we go on, you need to stop and read these articles. In the second article at the bottom, read the discussions where people argue whether Chris Roberts is right or wrong for what he did. What is your opinion? Was Chris Roberts right in what he did, or was he wrong? Did the manufacturer of IES do something wrong? Did United Airlines do something wrong? Did ABC News do something wrong in providing details about how Chris Roberts allegedly hacked into the airplane's navigation system? If you and I disagree on what is right and wrong, is that okay? Going on to the next case, borrowing a password. If you've not already done so, you should read case 1.1 of the textbook, Borrowing a Password. This one case has 3 different scenarios, each with related questions that ask you to consider your position in a variety of contexts. Take time to read those reflection questions after each scenario. Do you find that your position changes as you are asked to consider new context? Or do your feelings about right and wrong remain the same when you are given new information? In the scenario, Josh borrowed Alice's password so that he could complete his homework. We are told that he logged in, did his work, and logged out, all without looking at or modifying any of Alice's files. What are your initial opinions about this situation? Who is affected? What do we mean by affected? Let's go with who might care one way or another that Josh borrowed Alice's password. Clearly, Josh cared. Did Alice care? Should she have cared? What about the school where Josh is a student? What about the teacher who gave the assignment? Can you imagine any risk? For example, what if Josh had accidentally deleted a file on Alice's computer? What if he had deliberately done that? What if he sent the file to his instructor but accidentally did so from Alice's email account? What if he forgot to log out? As we make judgments about right and wrong, what exactly do we mean by those words? For example, it could be considered wrong if it was a violation of university policy, but perhaps one might not consider it wrong if no harm came from Josh's actions. So as you read this, what parties were affected when Alice gave her password to Josh? What were the risks involved? And did anyone do anything wrong? And how do you interpret the word wrong in this case? If a university policy stated that providing passwords to others is prohibited, would the action be wrong? How would you react if Alice were a software engineer at a software development firm? Why would this circumstance affect your decision? This case did not specify why Josh's account was disabled. How does this hinder your ability to decide the morality of the case? In this scenario, we're given new information about Alice's occupation. Should this change your opinion in any way? Does this change your opinion? Assuming this was Alice's school password and that Alice has since graduated from the school, does her occupation as a software engineer make a difference? Or perhaps she has additional obligations as a software engineer. Does the school have a particular policy on sharing of passwords? If so, is Alice still bound by that policy if she is no longer a student? And even if there were a policy that stated that sharing passwords is a violation of the policy, does it matter that Josh simply logged in, did his homework, and logged out? That seems different than logging in, pretending to be Alice by sending an email from her address and logging out. Both violate the don't share password rules. Are both wrong? Is one more wrong than the other? Suppose the terms of Alice's employment required her to protect the confidentiality of her company's corporate information, but she overlooked the fine details. Would her unawareness keep her action from being considered immoral? In the third version of this case, we are given more details to consider. That Josh used Alice's work resources to send his paper to his professor. This email was sent from Alice's network to a recipient, Josh's professor, outside of that network. Who, if anyone, is wrong in this situation? If Alice's employer had rules that were violated, was Josh bound by these rules? Was Alice bound by these rules if she did not fully understand the details of those rules? What if she was never told these rules? Notice that something that seems simple, the question of whether it is okay to share a password, may not have a simple answer. Answers depend on context, on what we know about Alice and Josh, on what we know about the university policies, and on what we know about the policies of Alice's employer. And even if we fully understand all of the context, there is still the question of what counts as wrong. Can something be wrong according to written policies and yet not be wrong morally and ethically? These are some of the big questions that we'll be addressing through this course. Summarizing the case study. Did you find your position changing as new details were introduced? What were your opinions? Were you able to justify those opinions? What affects your analysis of these situations? Your own experiences? Context? Course goal is using moral and ethical theories to analyze these situations. Case number 1.2 deals with the questions of what Officer Schmidt should do after observing a driver who failed to stop at a stop sign. There are several details in this case. If you've not already read the case or want to review the details, you should do that now. Note that the question is not, what do you think Officer Schmidt should do? It is, what should Officer Schmidt do? The goal of this course is not for your instructors to tell you the right thing for the officer to do. Your instructors would not claim to have such answers. Rather, you should learn how to think carefully about such situations. When you think about this particular case, there may be some details that you consider important, but which others might deem less important. But you should always be seeking details that matter because they may help you make decisions more carefully. Which things matter to you? That Dolores went through a stop sign? That a bee distracted Dolores? That she was on her way to daycare and then work? That she and the officer knew each other? That there may be written policy for police officers in how to handle such situations? That no harm was done? And then when you look at scenario 2 of this case in which a pedestrian was struck and injured by the car, does that change which details you consider important? The Officer Schmidt and Dolores case ends with a discussion of the no harm, no foul principle. The idea of this principle is that if no harm came from a person's actions, then no punishment is necessary. You may not have heard of this principle or have been thinking about this principle, but do you ever find yourself using this principle to guide how you view a situation? Suppose Dolores hit a pedestrian. How would that affect how you feel about this? Suppose the pedestrian were the mayor. Should this influence Officer Schmidt's action? Ethics and morality are related concepts, but they are not the same thing. And not all definitions of ethics are the same, nor are all definitions of morality. So in a course that deals with ethics and morality, it is important to have an agreed upon set of definitions for these concepts. In this course, we will use the definitions presented in Chapter 1 of the text. Ethics is a set of morally permissible standards of a group that each member of the group wants every other member to follow, even if their doing so would mean that he or she must do the same. So we will think of ethics as a set of standards for a particular group of people. Possible groups could be software engineers, police officers, teachers, students, politicians, physicians, and so on. When we answer questions of, is something good and why, we should be thinking about such groups of people. Whether something is good or not may depend on the ethical standards of a group to which that person belongs. And can you think of situations where a person is part of two different groups, where the right thing to do may be different for each of these two groups? Whereas ethics dealt with standards for a group, morality is the set of standards everyone wants everyone else to follow, even if their following them means having to do the same. Sometimes ethical decisions force us to consider moral decisions. When Alice, the software engineer, shared her password with a friend, she may have wanted to help her friend in need. Helping friends is a moral matter. However, sharing her password was ethically questionable. Sometimes, something that is ethical might be morally neutral. For example, it might be considered unethical for a store to sell iPhones below a certain price, even though doing so may not be considered moral or immoral. Moral theory. Before we delve into ethics, which are the morally permissible standards for a group, we need to lay a foundation of moral theories. These theories will help us throughout the course by providing us perspectives on how to view various cases. Not everyone agrees on a universal set of standards of what is good, so we will try to understand various ways that people have attempted to explain morality. As you learn about these moral theories, they will provide you with ways to think about the questions of how do we know that something is good, and why is it good? We will examine 9 moral theories. You should learn the names and major ideas behind these theories. Recall that ethics is a set of moral standards for a group of people. Morality is a set of moral standards for everyone. But what if the group of people is a set of all followers of a particular religion? Many religions define a set of standards that they would consider as being appropriate for all human beings. In that case, the ethical standards of those religious followers might be identical to the moral standards. This brings us to the first of our moral theories, the divine command theory. In this theory, something can only be considered good if and only if God commands it. There is no other standard, so those who espouse divine command theory would answer our 2 major questions like this. How do we know if something is good? The answer is because God commands it. Why is it good? Same answer, because God commands it. Whether or not this is a good basis for deciding right and wrong, there are problems with using this theory as basis for this course on ethics. There are a lot of religions and a lot of differences in how these religions define what is good. We need moral theories that help us regardless of the religious groups to which they belong. Our next theory is cultural relativism. Sorry, that's a hard word for me to say. Whereas divine command theory says that what is good is based solely on what God commands, cultural relativism argues that there are no universal answers to the questions of what is good and why. Rather, cultural relativism says that each culture decides how to answer those questions. At first glance, this might sound good. Can't we all just agree to get along? You live your life according to your culture's standards, and I'll live my life according to my culture's standards. It is easy to find situations in which highlight the flaws of cultural relativism. For example, the Nazis' internment camps resulted in the extermination of millions of people. Though most would describe this as immoral, cultural relativism would make the claim that Nazis were simply following a set of standards from their own culture. Some moral theories are based on what a person does. Other moral theories are based on why a person does something. Virtue theory, on the other hand, focuses on the nature of the person who does something. Introduced by Plato and developed by Aristotle, virtue theory answers 2 questions. What does it mean to be good, and how does one become good? To answer the questions of what does it mean to be good, Aristotle's approach was to list virtues. Let's take generosity as an example. One extreme would be a person who is stingy, unwilling to part with or give others money. The other extreme would be someone who spends money wastefully. The ideal mean of these is one who is generous. So generosity is one of the virtues listed by Aristotle. To answer the question of how does one become good, Aristotle would say, practice, practice, practice. Virtue is something learned over time. We should strive to mimic virtuous behavior until it becomes habit. Chapter 1 has a list of Aristotle's virtues and vices. It is worthwhile to understand this list. Some moral theories are based on the outcomes or consequences of an action. The question of whether something is good depends on whether the outcome is good. We will focus on a moral theory called utilitarianism, further breaking it into act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says that the right decision in a situation is the one that causes the greatest utility. Utility means maximizing the happiness in the world. Happiness means pleasure and the absence of pain. So utilitarianism focuses on making decisions that will bring the most pleasure and the least pain to the most people. Act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism have the same goal, maximizing happiness and pleasure and reducing pain. But both approach it in different ways. In act utilitarianism, an individual, when faced with a decision, must calculate whether the action will maximize happiness. Sometimes this can be an easy calculation, but often it can be complicated. For example, a certain action might increase one person's happiness and decrease another's. How do we calculate where there is an overall positive increase? Rule utilitarianism attempts to simplify the decision making by coming up with a set of easy to follow rules on how to make decisions. The rules are developed in such a way so as to have an overall positive effect, even though it might mean that sometimes some decisions will result in a decrease in happiness. The idea is that if everyone always follows a set of rules, there will be an overall positive increase in happiness. Individuals may be able to make exceptions to following the rules, but need to be able to justify such exceptions. So something that might be considered good in rule utilitarianism can be considered bad in act utilitarianism. Can you explain that and explain why? You should think about that. Deontological ethics can be thought of as rule-based ethics. It stems from ideas that came from Immanuel Kant in the 1700s. Only a good will can be considered good. We have goodwill only when we act out of duty. So if we accidentally do something that was a good consequence, that is not an example of goodwill. Immanuel Kant's main concept was that of categorical imperative. When faced with a moral question, act in a way that you would want to be a universal law. We could use this law to determine whether an act is moral. For example, is it okay to steal whatever you want? Stealing is good only if stealing could be adopted as a universal law. We could use logical arguments to demonstrate that stealing must be morally wrong. Your textbook demonstrates this argument. Contractionaryism is a moral theory whose main idea is the best way to promote our own self-interest is to promote the common interest of society. Should I believe this? Will I really be better off if I put the interests of society ahead of my own? That is what contractionaryism suggests. The textbook explains a well-known prisoner's dilemma as a way of analyzing the idea that acting for the common good is the best way to promote self-interest. There was a game show called Split or Steal, which is very similar to the prisoner's dilemma problem. Spend 10 minutes watching the 2 YouTube videos from this slide. A major goal in many moral theories is that all people be treated equally. That is what is meant by impartiality. Any moral theory should not give preferential treatment to any individuals or group. So what about something like need-based scholarship? It would seem that those give preferential treatment to a particular group of people. But there is more to the ethics of justice than just saying that all people be treated equally. John Rawls looked at rules necessary to ensure fairness. He stated that just societies must adhere to two principles. First and foremost, that everyone have as many basic freedoms as possible without preventing others from having the same freedoms. That inequalities may be necessary, but only acceptable if the inequalities give the most benefit to the last advantage. So let's revisit the question of need-based scholarships. Even though these scholarships benefit some people more than others, notice that they are meant to help economically disadvantaged people the most. As such, we could argue that need-based scholarships are consistent with Rawls' ethics of justice theory. So does ethics of justice argue that all people should always be treated equally? No. Instead, it argues that when equality is not reasonable, we should instead have a system that benefits those most in need. Our final moral theory is that of the ethics of caring. Nell Nodding's moral theory states that we should always strive to take care of others around us. When deciding whether a certain action is good, we need to ask, does it keep us in a role of caring with others? Let's think about how this is different from a couple other moral theories. First, conscientological ethics focused on rule-based ethics and on making logical arguments for whether an act is good or bad. Nodding's focus not on logic, but on the idea of caring. Rawls' ethics of justice focus on society as a whole and on what needs to happen in order to maintain equality within the system. Nodding's, rather than looking at the large system as a whole, focused on individual relationships, without regard for society as a whole. Nodding's ethics of caring also states that we need not concern ourselves with being caregivers for everyone. Rather, we should focus on caring for those we know and who have a relationship with us. So looking back at the 9 moral theories, we have briefly looked at these 9 moral theories. Many of these will be the basis for our analyzing moral and ethical questions throughout the rest of this course. You should spend some time reviewing these, reviewing the reading of Chapter 1, and in these slides. Can you summarize each of these theories? Can you pick 2 theories and explain their similarities and differences? Which 2 theories seem most similar and why? Which 2 theories seem most different and why? As we move forward in this course, you will frequently be asked to analyze ethical dilemmas. Ethical reasoning is not the same kind of reasoning that one would use to prove a mathematical theorem. In mathematics, we reason in a certain way in order to prove that a statement is or is not true. In ethics, we are not attempting to prove that a certain action is good or bad. A lot of times there may not be an absolute answer. Rather, we use a form of practical reasoning. In this course, you will write and discuss many ethical questions. As you do, keep these big ideas in mind. The point of such reasoning is not to win an argument or prove that you are right and someone else is wrong. The point is for you to better understand the positions of others and to help others better understand your position. Assume that each person has good intentions and is trying to be rational. Therefore, they should be treated with respect. Avoid inserting emotion into your language. Focus instead on facts. Remember that you are not arguing against a person, you are arguing against the statement of others. So a deliberative critical discussion is a conversation in which the participants consider the partners in the discussion, are well intended and informed with this understanding. Participants bring their knowledge to the discussion to share their own opinions and develop more refined perspectives. I'd like for you to avoid having any kind of charged language and hyperbole or ad hominem when you're forming your analysis of our cases. To get a better understanding of the kinds of reasoning and arguments that are expected of you, you should do two things. Read the case to tell or not to tell in Chapter 1. Formulate your own arguments as to why Arnold's actions were or were not ethical. Think carefully about how you explain your reasons to others. After you have read to tell or not to tell and have thought about your own arguments, read the sample deliberative critical discussion. Here you will see a hypothetical discussion in which a group of students are explaining their own arguments. Analyze this discussion to get a better sense of what is and is not appropriate ethical reasoning. Do all the students follow the guidelines we have discussed? As you analyze, write, and discuss your reasoning throughout the course, think about the student who made the best ethical arguments and why, and use those to guide in your own work. So to recap and prep for our online expectations, I'd like you to go back through this lecture and make sure you're prepared to discuss all of the thinking throughs and the other examples I mentioned that might come up in our online discussion. We'll talk to you this week online. Thank you.